Even a hard hat can't stay on that helmet head properly, man.
Good. That's fantastic. Yeah. Well, I'm here to see this very innovative energy project. It's a partnership between Stirling Council and Scottish Water, which turns wastewater into energy in a way that allows us to reduce carbon emissions. And it's an example of the kind of project, the kind of technology that we need to embrace more if we are to meet our very ambitious climate change targets, which we are determined to do. The climate emergency.
The climate emergency. You know, it's funny. This climate emergency that Helmet Head and all the rest of the progressive entourage speak about. After they declared this so-called emergency, what was one of the first things they all went and did? Here in Scotland, anyway. They went on a 2-month holiday. Really sounds like a bit of a crisis. Can't be that bad. Can't be that much of an emergency if you can postpone any action for 2 months. The so-called emergency. And let's not forget here this talk of carbon neutral societies by 2030 because the UN effing said so. Meanwhile, China is still pumping out emissions like no tomorrow. So any so-called targets that we may or may not meet in the future, they're rather irrelevant. Which then does beg the question, why are we allowing China to pump out all this toxic carbon if it really is detrimental to the future of our planet? Sounds to me as if this is all a bunch of BS. Greta Thunberg and the UN have declared a climate emergency, and Sturgeon, of course, has to take centre stage and showcase that she is the best out of all these fake politicians that the UN has planted in our countries. What's new?
Is the biggest moral challenge facing the whole of the world today, and I'm determined that Scotland is in the vanguard of meeting that challenge.
Yeah.
First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, has finally lifted the lid on her relationship with the Prime Minister Boris Johnson after a somewhat frosty face-to-face encounter at her official residence in Edinburgh last week. As we know, the two don't exactly see eye to eye politically, but particularly on the issue of Brexit. Nicola Sturgeon believes that his stance, his exit vision, is somewhat delusional.
There is a line between optimism and delusion, and selling something that is not true. That's where the Brexit argument has made the mistake, and Boris
Same as your campaign.
Johnson in particular. He shrugs his shoulders quite literally when you talk to him about the consequences of crashing out at the end of October.
And you gloss over how the EU is blatantly changing into the superstate. You gloss over the fact that you plan to give the fishing industries right back into the EU as a means to negotiate our way back into the European Union. You gloss over the fact that a million Scottish people voted to leave the European Union. You also gloss over the fact that you lost the 30 of your seats, thus making you a minority government with the Greens in 2017 because of your push for IndyRef 2. All convenient facts that seem to be left out of the discussion whenever Helmet Head decides to show that ugly mug.
With no deal, as if they don't matter or he can wish them away.
Scotland had re-energised and renewed calls for a second independence referendum.
That's great, but let's not forget here, if Brexit was stopped tomorrow, if Brexit was stopped today, then Sturgeon would have no grounds for an independence referendum, nor would she really want to call for one. She wouldn't need to, because let's not forget here, all this talk of independence is only starting to make its way into the headlines again because there was a so-called possibility of a no-deal Brexit occurring. You know, the default legal position. It's not as if it's a mandate, it's not as if it's a policy, albeit these lefties try to convince the public that that is what it is. It is in fact the default position in law, supposedly.
Particularly in the case of a no-deal Brexit scenario. Plus, we've just found out, according to a shock new poll, what it's found is that just days after Boris Johnson visited the region, the majority of the Scottish population are now in favour of voting for independence at a whopping 52%.
Oh, whopping 52%, you know, that's rather familiar, those sort of numbers, are they not? Because I recall the Brexit referendum having numbers very similar to that. And yet, we never heard the end of it from lefties. We never heard the end of it from the crybaby Remainers. That wasn't really an accurate representation. It was too close, we should really have another referendum to settle the scores. But yet, when the roles are reversed and the numbers are switched round, all of a sudden, this is something that we can take as gospel truth. Something that we can have confidence in, apparently. Double standards and contradictions are rife with lefties on a global scale. But ever more so when it comes to the SNP and their filthy lies. Yeah. And what happened to this supposed surge in support for the SNP? They've been talking to no end for months about the rise in support for independence. Everybody in Scotland's apparently on Beta Blackford's wavelength. And then when one poll comes out that shows a clear majority for independence or a second referendum, all of a sudden they jump on it. They've been telling us for months that this was the case, so it surely shouldn't come as a shock. And let's not forget here another thing that I've said before in a video not too long ago. If the SNP really give a shit about independence, and that was what they really want, as they're trying to now convince everyone yet again, that's what they've always wanted, it's all about independence. You know, why didn't they just vote for Theresa May's deal? You know, they would have had their mandate, and this so-called surge in support that they claimed that they had all those months ago would have worked to their advantage. Oh, no.
It comes as a significant blow to Boris Johnson's attempt to keep the union together, but his do-or-die approach to leaving the European Union, come what may, on October the 31st is seen as a very toxic position for those in Scotland, particularly given the fact that they voted to remain in the EU in the 2016 referendum.
It begs belief that after 3 years, they still peddle this line, and it makes the SNP's plight seem very sincere and sympathetic, and it makes people think that they've got a point, etc., completely forgetting the fact that Sturgeon told people to vote to remain, because if they voted to leave, they would never see an independence referendum again. So in effect, it was either fear porn or tactical voting, depending on the IQ of the people listening to what she was saying, but the point remains the same. It's not a case of Scotland unanimously voting to remain in the EU because they wish to remain in the EU. Many people voted to remain in the EU purely because she told them to. Let's leave that fact out though. Doesn't suit the narrative now.
Sturgeon is now coming out to say that she will fight for Scotland not to be dragged down this path of a no-deal Brexit scenario. But her attacks are not just at Boris Johnson. They've also been hitting out at the former Prime Minister, Theresa May. She was describing the conversations with Theresa May as soul-destroying.
Stones and glass houses, Sturgeon?
Quite harsh words there, saying that Theresa May was particularly awkward, even in those somewhat light-hearted moments, because she never really came off script, her pre-prepared scripts.
The pre-prepared scripts? Well, they're all at that capers, including Helmet Head. She didn't come as a shock to anybody. The audacity of her to say that, though, you know, considering she spends all her time whining about Brexit, or calling the Tory party far right, or in fact peddling bullshit about climate change and carbon emissions. Doing that bidding for the EU and the UN.
All of this comes as the European Union is now a step closer to accepting that the UK could crash out of the European Union without a deal. And they are saying that they will no longer be holding any further Brexit talks with Britain if this stalemate position over the backstop continues. As we know, Brussels say that what the UK wants is unacceptable, whereas Downing Street are still saying that they are going to try and change and scrap the backstop. So what we can see is just...
What incentive would there be for the EU to even think about opening up a withdrawal agreement or starting afresh when you've got the likes of Helmet Heads, the SNP, the Lib Dems, etc., campaigning vigorously and crying and whining all day long about remaining and about the perils that will follow suit if no deal occurs. So they know they just need to bide their time, and hopefully something will emerge from the horizon, aka Brexit being scuppered, or a second vote, or something along those lines. You know, they've heard this insufferable diatribe from the SNP and other minions, as well as all the other parties up and down the countries, and they just need to sit back, patiently waiting for it all to capitulate, or at the very least, stick to their guns.
Just a few weeks away till this October deadline, it seems like Britain has gone full circle and right back to where we began 3 years ago.